In the opening weeks of 1942, Japanese forces surged across the western Pacific with stunning speed. Island chains fell, ports were seized, and Allied defenses collapsed in sequence. Yet beneath this apparent coherence, Japanese operations were already diverging. Army units advanced toward objectives the Navy had not prioritized. Naval forces seized territory the Army had neither planned to garrison nor supply. Two campaigns unfolded at once, sharing a flag but not a strategy. This disjunction was not the product of confusion at the front. It reflected a deeper structural reality. Imperial Japan entered the war without a unified command system capable of imposing a single strategic vision. The Army and the Navy operated as parallel institutions, each with its own doctrine, procurement systems, intelligence networks, and strategic priorities. Cooperation occurred when interests aligned, but alignment was never guaranteed. The roots of this division predated the war by decades. Japan's modernization in the late 19th and early 20th centuries produced two military cultures that evolved separately. The Army looked toward continental power, shaped by campaigns in Manchuria and China. It envisioned decisive land battles and territorial control. The Navy, influenced by maritime strategy and Western naval thought, focused on sea control and fleet engagement. Each service defined national security through its own lens. Institutional independence reinforced rivalry. Both services reported directly to the emperor, bypassing civilian authority and limiting mechanisms for arbitration. Budget competition became strategic competition. Each service justified its programs by promoting threats that aligned with its preferred mission. Over time, this hardened into doctrine. The Army emphasized the Soviet Union and China. The Navy emphasized the United States and the Pacific. Neither fully subordinated its vision to the other. By the late 1930s, this divergence had produced parallel war plans. The Army committed the nation to a prolonged conflict in China without naval enthusiasm or support. The Navy prepared for a potential maritime conflict with the United States, while the Army remained focused inland. Strategic decisions accumulated without integration. Japan did not choose between continental and maritime war. It attempted both. This structural schizophrenia shaped how Japan fought from the beginning. Operations succeeded tactically, but they did not converge toward a single end state. Gains created new commitments rather than resolving old ones. Resources were consumed along divergent axes. What appeared as expansion masked fragmentation, and early success concealed a fundamental inability to decide what kind of war Japan was actually fighting. The absence of a single strategic authority meant that compromise replaced coordination. When disagreements arose, they were settled through bargaining rather than directive. The Army and Navy traded concessions, carving the war into spheres of responsibility that reflected institutional interests instead of operational logic. These compromises produced plans that were internally coherent within each service, but mutually reinforcing only by coincidence. Nowhere was this clearer than in the decision to go to war with the United States. The Navy understood that a prolonged industrial conflict against American shipbuilding and aviation capacity was unwinnable. Its strategy rested on a short, violent campaign designed to secure a defensive perimeter and force negotiation. The Army, already committed in China and wary of American pressure, accepted war as inevitable, but did not share the Navy's assumptions about duration or decisive points. It prepared to fight on land across Asia regardless of maritime outcomes. The result was a war launched without agreement on its end state. The Navy sought sea denial and attrition of enemy fleets. The Army sought territorial depth and resource control. Each pursued objectives that increased the burden on the other. Island seizures required garrisons the Army was reluctant to spare. Continental advances demanded shipping and protection the Navy could not sustainably provide. Neither service recalculated its goals in response to the other's constraints. Operational planning reflected this divide. Joint operations existed on paper but were often negotiated late and executed unevenly. Intelligence was not fully shared. Logistics planning remained service-specific. Even maps and terminology differed. Coordination depended on personalities and circumstance rather than institutional process. When cooperation failed, there was no mechanism to enforce correction. This fragmentation extended to training and doctrine. The Army and Navy developed separate air arms, each competing for aircraft, pilots, and fuel. They fielded different aircraft types, used incompatible communications, and pursued distinct tactical philosophies. Instead of a unified air strategy, Japan operated parallel air wars that rarely converged. Early victories obscured these weaknesses. Allied forces, unprepared and dispersed, collapsed under the initial shock. The appearance of seamless advance masked the fact that Japan's forces were moving along different strategic logics. Success postponed reckoning, it did not resolve contradiction. As the perimeter expanded, the cost of division increased. Every new objective required agreement on who would hold it, supply it, and defend it. Each decision reopened the underlying conflict between continental and maritime priorities. The war grew larger, but Japan's ability to direct it coherently did not. As operations extended beyond the initial phase, the consequences of this divided purpose became harder to ignore. In China, the Army consumed men and material in a conflict that offered no decisive resolution. The Navy gained little from these operations, yet paid the indirect cost in fuel, shipping, and political constraint. In the Pacific, the Navy seized island positions whose strategic value lay in naval and air control, not territorial occupation. The Army was then tasked with defending and supplying these positions despite neither planning for them nor prioritizing them. This mismatch produced chronic tension. Garrisons were under strength or inadequately equipped. Supply allocations reflected negotiation rather than necessity. When shortages emerged, each service blamed the other. The Army accused the Navy of overextending maritime commitments. The Navy accused the Army of hoarding resources for continental ambitions that offered no strategic return. These disputes rarely resulted in unified adjustment. They hardened existing positions. The lack of integration was particularly evident in intelligence. Each service maintained its own collection and analysis apparatus. Information was filtered through institutional bias before being shared, if it was shared at all. Assessments of enemy capability diverged. The Navy emphasized American naval and air production. The Army discounted these figures, focusing instead on ground forces and regional threats. Strategic planning proceeded on incompatible assumptions. Logistics planning suffered accordingly. Shipping, the most critical shared resource, became a point of constant contention. The Navy controlled transport assets, but prioritized fleet operations and fuel supply. The Army required sustained lift to support forces across China and Southeast Asia. Without a unified prioritization framework, shipping was allocated piecemeal. Bottlenecks multiplied. Critical deliveries arrived late or not at all. These frictions did not paralyze Japanese operations immediately. Discipline and sacrifice compensated temporarily. Units fought effectively within their assigned roles, but the system lacked elasticity. When losses mounted or conditions changed, adaptation required cooperation that institutions were not designed to provide. The strategic environment tightened rapidly. Allied forces recovered from initial shock and began to apply pressure across multiple axes. Japan faced a war that demanded concentration and prioritization. Instead, it responded through parallel efforts that diluted strength. Each service pursued its preferred solution, assuming the other would adapt. By 1943, the cost of this approach was evident. Japan was no longer dictating tempo. It was reacting, often incoherently, to threats that required integrated response. The structural division that had once been masked by success now shaped failure. The Army and Navy continued to fight with determination, but they fought different wars, drawing from the same shrinking pool of resources. The strain became acute when Allied offensives forced Japan to defend rather than expand. Defense demanded coordination, air cover integrated with ground garrisons, shipping protected by both services, intelligence fused into a single picture. Japan possessed none of these as a matter of structure. Each service defended according to its own priorities, often at cross purposes. Island defense exposed the fault lines most clearly. The Navy viewed islands primarily as components of a maritime barrier, valuable for airfields and surveillance. Once air and naval utility declined, the Navy's interest diminished. The Army viewed territory in traditional terms, emphasizing garrison and endurance. As a result, islands were often defended heavily long after their operational value had evaporated, while others critical to naval defense were under-resourced because the Army saw little purpose in holding them. Operational control reflected this ambiguity. In some areas, Army commanders exercised authority over naval aviation units without shared doctrine or communications. In others, naval commanders directed ground forces they neither trained nor supplied adequately. Unity of command existed in name, but not in function. Orders conflicted, responsibilities blurred. Failures were difficult to diagnose because no single authority owned the outcome. The competition extended into production and procurement. The Army and Navy demanded separate aircraft designs, separate weapons, and separate supply chains. Industrial output was divided not by strategic need, but by institutional entitlement. Factories produced multiple versions of similar systems to satisfy rival requirements. This duplication wasted capacity and complicated maintenance in the field. As the strategic situation worsened, competition intensified rather than diminished. Each service sought to protect its remaining influence and resources. Concessions became harder to extract. Planning conferences produced vague agreements that masked unresolved disagreement. The absence of an enforceable joint command meant that unity depended on goodwill that no longer existed. The effect on operations was cumulative. Defenses were layered but not integrated. Air power was present but poorly coordinated. Counterattacks were planned without regard for naval or logistical realities. The enemy encountered resistance everywhere, but decisive resistance nowhere. Japan's war effort began to fracture along the same institutional lines that had shaped its expansion. The Army and Navy did not cease fighting. They fought on with increasing intensity, but without a shared conception of how their efforts were meant to converge. The nation's strategy dissolved into parallel struggles that drained strength without producing coherence. The consequences of this fragmentation were most severe in the air. Japan maintained two separate air forces throughout the war, each tied to its parent service and optimized for different missions. The Army Air Force focused on close support and continental operations. The Naval Air Service concentrated on carrier warfare and long-range maritime strike. Aircraft types, training pipelines, tactics, and even terminology diverged. Interoperability was minimal. This separation prevented the creation of a unified air defense or offensive strategy. When Allied bombers struck, responsibility for interception depended on geography rather than capability. In some regions, Army fighters defended naval facilities with limited coordination. In others, naval aircraft protected Army installations without shared command. Radar coverage, where it existed, fed into separate networks. Gaps emerged not from lack of assets, but from lack of integration. Attrition exposed the cost. Pilot training and replacement were handled independently, competing for fuel, instructors, and aircraft. Losses in one service could not be offset by surplus in the other. Experienced pilots remained trapped within institutional boundaries. As quality declined, the inability to pool remaining expertise accelerated collapse. Strategic bombing intensified these problems. Industrial centers producing aircraft and engines for both services were attacked, yet repair and dispersal efforts remained uncoordinated. Each service prioritized recovery of its own programs, duplicating effort and wasting scarce resources. The enemy benefited from striking a system that fractured under pressure. Logistics mirrored this disunity. Fuel allocation was negotiated rather than planned centrally. Army and Navy stockpiles were maintained separately, even when units operated in proximity. Shortages became acute while reserves existed elsewhere. Transportation assets were misallocated because no single authority could impose priorities across services. Attempts to correct these issues came late and lacked enforcement. Joint committees produced recommendations without power. Informal coordination improved at the margins but could not overcome structural separation. The system resisted integration because integration threatened institutional identity. As Allied forces advanced, Japan's inability to coordinate air, sea, and land defense proved decisive. Attacks were met piecemeal. Successes could not be exploited. Failures could not be contained. What might have been manageable setbacks under unified command became cascading defeats. The air war revealed the core problem in stark form. Japan did not lack aircraft or courage. It lacked a system that could bring its remaining strength to bear as a single force. The Army and Navy continued to fight with determination, but they did so as rivals sharing a battlefield, rather than partners executing a common plan. The logistical consequences of this rivalry deepened as Japan's situation deteriorated. Shipping losses mounted under Allied submarine and air attack, yet the allocation of remaining transport remained contested. The Navy, responsible for convoy protection, prioritized fuel and fleet requirements. The Army demanded lift for ground forces scattered across Asia and the Pacific. Without unified authority, compromises satisfied neither. Critical garrisons went undersupplied, while resources were consumed moving units whose strategic value had already declined. This competition distorted decision-making. The Army continued to reinforce positions based on territorial logic, even when sea control was lost. The Navy withdrew support from areas it judged untenable, leaving Army units isolated. Neither approach was inherently irrational within its own framework. Together, they produced paralysis. Forces remained committed long after their purpose had vanished, while emerging threats elsewhere went unmet. Strategic assessment fractured along the same lines. The Navy focused on the balance of ships, aircraft carriers, and fuel reserves. The Army emphasized manpower and ground control. When Allied advances threatened the inner defensive perimeter, interpretations differed. The Navy saw a shrinking maritime battle space that demanded concentration. The Army saw a continental struggle that required holding ground regardless of naval realities. Each service prepared for a different war. The absence of integrated planning became fatal as Japan lost the initiative. Defensive lines were drawn without agreement on how they would be supplied or relieved. Counteroffensives were proposed without assurance of air or naval support. Operations failed not because they were poorly conceived in isolation, but because they rested on assumptions the other service did not share. As resources dwindled, rivalry hardened into mutual distrust. Information was withheld, requests were delayed. Each service sought to preserve its autonomy in the face of defeat. Cooperation, once merely inconvenient, became politically dangerous within the institutions themselves. Officers who advocated integration risked marginalization. The result was a war effort increasingly defined by contradiction. Japan possessed forces but could not assemble them coherently. It retained will but lacked mechanism. The Army and Navy fought on, drawing from the same exhausted pool, yet unable to agree on where that effort should be concentrated. Strategic schizophrenia had become operational reality. The effect of this division became most destructive when Japan attempted to respond to simultaneous crises. Allied offensives unfolded across the Central Pacific, the Southwest Pacific, and China at the same time. Each demanded resources that could no longer be supplied in full. A unified command might have accepted risk in one theater to preserve strength in another. Japan did not possess the mechanism to make that choice. Instead, the Army and Navy responded independently. Naval planners focused on preserving fleet units and defending approaches vital to sea control. Army planners reinforced land positions considered politically or symbolically essential. The result was dispersion at the moment concentration was required. Forces were committed everywhere in insufficient strength rather than decisively anywhere. This dispersion affected planning at the tactical level. Units fought without expectation of relief or reinforcement because neither service could guarantee support from the other. Commanders adjusted by preparing for isolation. Defensive doctrine shifted toward endurance rather than maneuver. This reduced flexibility and increased losses once positions were bypassed or encircled. The rivalry also undermined learning. Combat experience gathered by one service rarely translated into institutional change in the other. Lessons about Allied tactics, logistics, and command were absorbed unevenly. Adaptation lagged because knowledge remained siloed. The enemy faced an opponent that relearned the same lessons repeatedly, rather than consolidating them. As the war entered its final year, the strategic picture hardened. Japan no longer had the capacity to contest Allied advance meaningfully. What remained was resistance shaped by institutional inertia. The Army prepared for decisive land battles that never came. The Navy husbanded forces for fleet actions that could no longer be decisive. Each service acted rationally within its own worldview, but the world had changed. The persistence of separate wars within a single nation revealed the cost of unresolved rivalry. Japan had mobilized immense effort, yet lacked the structure to direct it effectively. The war was no longer lost because of enemy superiority alone. It was lost because Japan could not decide how to fight it as a unified whole. This failure of unity became irreversible as defeat approached. The deeper Japan retreated, the more coordination was required to compensate for shrinking margins. Yet coordination was precisely what the system could not produce. Each loss reduced trust. Each setback reinforced institutional defensiveness. Instead of integration, the services doubled down on autonomy. Planning for homeland defense revealed the final expression of this divide. The Army prepared for mass ground resistance, focusing on mobilization of manpower and fortification of terrain. The Navy, stripped of its fleet, emphasized air and maritime denial, investing remaining resources into separate concepts of defense. These plans existed side by side, but they were never fully reconciled. They assumed different enemy approaches and required incompatible allocations of the same dwindling resources. Production and training followed suit. Aircraft programs diverged further. Weapons and munitions were tailored to service-specific requirements rather than common use. Fuel distribution remained contested. Even at the end, when scarcity demanded unity, fragmentation persisted. The system had no lever capable of enforcing convergence. The tragedy of this arrangement was not incompetence or lack of effort. Japanese officers and soldiers fought with discipline and resolve. The failure lay in structure. Institutions designed to compete could not suddenly cooperate under existential pressure. Rivalry that once generated innovation now generated paralysis. Allied commanders recognized this weakness and exploited it deliberately. They applied pressure across multiple domains, confident that Japan could not respond coherently. Each operation forced a choice Japan was structurally unable to make. The enemy did not need to defeat a unified strategy. It faced two incomplete ones. By the time Japan's leaders confronted the reality of defeat, the division had become normalized. Separate wars had become habit. There was no shared language, no shared framework through which to reimagine the conflict. What remained was endurance without purpose. The Army and Navy did not fail because they disagreed. They failed because disagreement was embedded in the system itself. Strategic schizophrenia was not a metaphor, it was the operational condition under which Japan fought the war from beginning to end. The cost of this condition could be measured in wasted opportunity as much as in defeat. Moments existed when concentrated effort might have altered the tempo of the war, even if it could not reverse its outcome. Unified allocation of air power might have delayed Allied advances. Concentrated shipping protection might have sustained key garrisons longer. Coordinated intelligence might have reduced surprise. None of these possibilities required brilliance, only integration. Instead, Japanese responses remained fragmented. Success in one domain did not translate into advantage elsewhere. When the Navy achieved tactical successes, the Army was often unable to exploit them on land. When the Army held territory at great cost, the Navy could not protect the sea lines that made that defense meaningful. Gains canceled rather than compounded. This pattern shaped Allied perceptions. Opposing commanders learned that Japanese resistance, though fierce locally, lacked strategic elasticity. They planned operations accordingly, applying pressure where coordination would be required to respond effectively. Each thrust widened the gap between Army and Navy priorities, forcing decisions that deepened division. The absence of a unified command also distorted civil-military relations. Civil leadership lacked authority to impose resolution between services. Political compromise substituted for strategic choice. Decisions were deferred or diluted until circumstances removed alternatives entirely. War aims remained ambiguous because the instruments of war could not agree on their application. As defeat became inevitable, the separate wars converged only in exhaustion. The Army and Navy shared suffering, but not synthesis. Their final efforts reflected accumulated habits rather than adaptive strategy. Resistance continued without prospect of meaningful coordination or decisive effect. Japan's experience illustrated a fundamental truth of modern war. Industrial conflict demanded not only resources and courage, but organizational coherence. Without it, strength dissipated across competing visions. The Army and Navy were powerful institutions. Together, they might have formed a formidable whole. Apart, they drained the nation they were meant to defend. The strategic schizophrenia that defined Japan's war was not cured by urgency or sacrifice. It endured because it was structural, reinforced by history, culture, and institutional design. When the war ended, it ended not with a unified defeat, but with parallel failures that had never truly converged into a single strategy. The persistence of this division shaped how Japan's war was ultimately concluded. Even as Allied forces closed in, strategic discussions continued to reflect separate institutional priorities rather than a unified assessment of reality. The Army evaluated the war through the lens of ground resistance and manpower mobilization. The Navy assessed it through the remaining capacity of air and maritime forces. Each measured endurance differently, and neither framework alone captured the full scope of collapse. This divergence delayed recognition of finality. Losses that rendered one service's strategy untenable did not necessarily invalidate the others. As a result, the threshold for acknowledging defeat rose artificially. The absence of a single strategic calculus meant that no moment existed when all instruments aligned to signal that continuation was impossible. Defeat arrived not as a decision, but as an accumulation of irreversible conditions. Operationally, this manifested as continued sacrifice without strategic effect. Units fought on in isolation, disconnected from any realistic prospect of altering outcomes. Resources were expended to sustain positions that no longer influenced the war's direction. The Army and Navy remained committed to their respective visions even as the material basis for both disappeared. The Allied campaign exploited this inertia. By striking across domains simultaneously, it prevented either service from concentrating on its preferred solution. Every blow forced Japan to respond where it was weakest institutionally. The pressure did not need to be overwhelming in any single dimension. It only needed to be continuous and multi-directional. In the end, Japan did not lose because one service failed while the other succeeded. Both fought with determination within the limits of their doctrines. What failed was the mechanism that should have fused their efforts into a coherent whole. Without that fusion, endurance became waste rather than resistance. The war concluded as it had been fought, through parallel struggles that shared a nation but not a strategy. The Army and Navy reached exhaustion separately, having never fully aligned their purposes. Strategic schizophrenia had shaped the conflict from its opening moves to its final collapse. The consequences of this failure extended beyond military defeat. Japan entered the post-war period having learned that courage and sacrifice could not compensate for structural incoherence. The separation of Army and Navy had once been defended as a source of balance, even creativity. In war, it proved to be a liability that magnified every shortage and accelerated every setback. Post-war analysis made clear that the problem was not personality or momentary disagreement. It was institutional design. Separate chains of command, separate planning staffs, separate intelligence systems, and separate procurement pipelines ensured that unity depended on consensus rather than authority. When consensus failed, there was no mechanism to impose alignment. Modern war did not tolerate that ambiguity. The contrast with Allied command structures was stark. Allied forces argued, competed, and disagreed, but they operated within unified frameworks that forced resolution. Joint commands possessed authority to allocate resources and set priorities across services. Once decisions were made, execution followed. Japan lacked this capacity by design. The legacy of fighting separate wars shaped how historians later understood Japan's defeat. The outcome was not predetermined by material inferiority alone. Japan mobilized enormous resources, and demonstrated operational skill repeatedly. What it could not do was transform effort into cumulative effect. Each service achieved local success that failed to compound because it was not integrated into a broader strategy. In that sense, Japan's strategic schizophrenia was not merely a wartime failure, it was the culmination of choices made long before the war began, embedded in the structure of the state and the culture of its military institutions. When crisis demanded unity, fragmentation answered instead. The Army and Navy fought with honor according to their own doctrines. They failed together because they never truly fought as one. The final irony was that Japan possessed many of the elements required for coherent strategy. It had experienced officers, disciplined forces, advanced technology in key areas, and a population capable of enduring extraordinary hardship. What it lacked was the institutional ability to decide collectively how those elements were to be used. Strategy remained contested terrain long after the enemy had seized the initiative. By fighting separate wars under a single flag, Japan transformed disagreement into destiny. Every major failure carried the imprint of divided purpose. Resources were exhausted without concentration. Sacrifice was made without convergence. Effort accumulated sideways rather than forward. The nation did not collapse from a single decisive blow, but from the cumulative effect of never striking decisively itself. The Army-Navy rivalry did not merely complicate Japan's war, it defined it. From China to the Central Pacific, from logistics to air power, from planning to execution, strategic schizophrenia shaped outcomes at every level. It ensured that success remained local and defeat systemic. Modern war rewarded unity of direction above all else. Japan entered that war without it and never truly acquired it. When the fighting ended, it ended not because one strategy had failed, but because there had never been one to begin with.